No! No! Yes! Yes! Ah! So, if you haven't guessed, I love Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. It was, like with many others, my very first Fire Emblem, and I remember as a kid getting totally sucked into its world and story. I remember staying up really late on school nights playing it when I wasn't supposed to, and that when I wasn't playing Golden Sun or Zelda, I was playing Fire Emblem. Now years later I would fall in love with Path of Radiance, my actual favorite Fire Emblem, and the series has continued even today to newfound success 12 years later. Now I went into this in my Fire Emblem Echoes review, so I'll keep it short, but when this game came out there was a lot of hype surrounding two new characters released in Super Smash Bros. Melee, Marth and Roy. Marth being from the original Fire Emblem, and Roy being from the recently released Binding Blade. The series at this point had been Japan exclusive, but Nintendo saw the interest and said, why not? So you can imagine the confusion when the game we got featured a redhead that was not in fact Roy, but his father Eliwood. That's because this game is a prequel to Binding Blade. Still, Nintendo, similar to the Final Fantasy II and III situation, decided to just title the game Fire Emblem, which has ironically made talking about this game really confusing. So, Fire Emblem 7 was the first American-released Fire Emblem over here.
Oh, yeah?
And it's partly because of Smash Bros. It made people go like, oh, I want to play the series. Now,
was that with Eliwood, right?
Eliwood is in Fire Emblem 7, yes. Alright, so it's a prequel to Roy's game.
Okay.
Okay. So Roy's game is Fire Emblem 6. So Fire Emblem 7 is a prequel to 6. Now...
Wait, hold on. So, Roy's game, Eliwood's son,
yes.
is in Fire Emblem 6.
Yes.
And now they have Eliwood's game.
Yes, which is a prequel to Roy's game.
But it's after, it's called 7.
Well, it's not actually called Fire Emblem 7. It's called Fire Emblem.
Well, now it's called Fire Emblem 7.
Well, no, the fans call it Fire Emblem 7 because it's just called Fire Emblem.
Ah.
Fire Emblem 7 is in Japan called Fire Emblem Rekka no Ken, which translates to Blazing Blade. And Fire Emblem 6 is called Fire Emblem Binding Blade.
What?
So, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade is the prequel to Fire Emblem Binding Blade.
So Blazing Blade, prequel to Binding Blade, even though Blazing Blade comes after Binding Blade.
Well, yes, it's released afterwards. It's also just called Fire Emblem.
But Roy's game is called Fire Emblem 6?
No, that's just Fire Emblem Binding Blade.
Ah.
Some people refer to it as Fire Emblem 6, also because the name's confusing. So, to recap, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade
is...
The fans, in response to this, often just call the game Fire Emblem 7, as it is the 7th Fire Emblem game created, but for the sake of this review, I'm going to be calling it Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. The game takes place in the continent of Elib, a land with 5 countries, a desert, and a patch of land neither game really talks about. What is this land? These countries are Lycia, a country comprised of sub-territories ruled by individual rulers, something akin to the EU or the US, except with nobility. Bern, the game's empire, Etruria, the good empire you never go to in this game, Sake, a land in need of lawn mowing, and last but not least, Ilia, a snow-ridden land you also never go to, but invests in cute Pegasus sisters that do mercenary work across the continent. A long time ago, there was a war between dragons and humans. It's never really explained in this game why this war started, but all we know is mankind took 8 weapons and brought them to extinction. After the war, the heroes scattered across the continent, founding many of the different nations and putting their weapons into hiding. Skip to modern day and a tactician is woken up by Lyn, the first of this game's protagonists. The tactician doesn't really have a character and is more of a surrogate the game uses so the characters can directly give exposition to the player, which will admittedly have a lot of moments of characters looking directly at the screen. This is actually a clever idea and concept though, as this also allows the game to more naturally, I guess, give information to the player on how to play the game, while keeping it oddly in the universe since you and the tactician are the same. This was likely done since they knew this was going to be the first Fire Emblem in the West, and this is reflected in every aspect of the game's design, but more on that later. Within the first few chapters, we learn a lot about Lynn's motivations, and the game continues to subtly hint at a loneliness and fear of loss. Lynn's entire clan was murdered by bandits in a sudden raid, and while not consumed with revenge, this haunts her throughout the opening part of the game. After being alone, she discovers that family still lives, and departs on a perilous journey to meet them, even with every obstacle standing in her path. This opening part of the game is actually pretty easy to follow and light on politics, as it is designed to ease you into the main part of the game, during which Lynn is a character that is pretty easy to like, although certainly doesn't have an amazing amount of depth. Well, for the most part. Now I just mentioned the first of the protagonists. Something novel about Blazing Sword is how the game follows three protagonists, Lynn, Eliwood, and Hector. For the first 10 chapters of the game, you follow Lynn on her adventures, while the remainder of the game follows the perspective of Hector and Eliwood, with Lynn rejoining the campaign early on in their stories. Something that surprised me though is I found Eliwood to actually be a rather endearing character despite how I remembered him. He is a charming person, but in a believable way, where characters such as Roy mainly just have a face of naivety. Eliwood has a lot of points of emotional conflict. The guy just wants to find his dad and suffers pain at the hands of the villains. He laughs, he jokes, he gets angry, the whole range is there. Hector is a huge fan favorite, and it's easy to see why. Hector has quite a lot of personality, he's strong-headed and proud, but he is also kind and compassionate and brings out a lot of fun banter with Eliwood. One of my favorites of their banter is a conversation the two had about Lynn. "So this is Kaylin? You think we ought to present ourselves to Lord Hassan?" "We're simply passing through, so I don't see the need." "I'm curious how Lindis is getting along, though." "Lindis? Marcus Kaylin's granddaughter." "Oh, her. The missing heir who dealt with Lundgren last year. Didn't you have something to do with that?" And? The granddaughter? Is she a beauty?" "Oh my gosh. A beauty? I think it must be her Sakai heritage. She's striking." "Striking? Too bad, isn't it?" "What?" "That we don't have the time to see her, lover boy." "No, Lindis and we're not." "You're not? Then why are you getting so worked up?" "Hector, don't make me angry." You are so much fun to tease. The villains of the game are also pretty cool, particularly the Black Fang. While there are some clearly one-dimensional villains, such as the main villain Nurgle, the Black Fang as an organization is pretty cool, and I like the way the game handled them. And even Nurgle has a lot of moments where he just messes things up, and the main characters have to figure out what to do, and it's just really well made. I love pretty much every single villain in this game. The overall cast of the game is also pretty darn awesome, probably second only to Path of Radiance for me. All of them are likable for one reason or another, and have distinct personalities and motives. My favorites of the bunch are probably Nino,
Do my best!
Sane, Matthew, Pent, Sarah, and Ninian. Although I like basically every single character in this game, so it's really hard to even pick out like absolute favorites. It's just a really great cast, and I don't know what else to say. Now, I could go on and on about why I love the plot, but I think it's best for you to experience it for yourself. It's really well made, and as far as Fire Emblem plots go, it's one of the best. If I have any gripe with it though, the game, as well as Roy's game, do a terrible job of explaining how Lycia works. It's comprised of various territories, but I couldn't really tell you which ones are in charge, where they are located, and vice versa. Not to mention royal casualties are oddly high in this game, with very little uproar to the matter. Though, honestly, this is by far my biggest gripe, as at the end of the day, the plot is very character-driven, and that's how I like it. The gameplay of Blazing Sword is basically, well, Fire Emblem. If you're familiar with the series, you know what to expect, but if you're not, well, this is probably the best entry point. While I've heard many argue Fire Emblem Awakening is the best starting point, I have to disagree, as while casual mode is nice, should you go classic, the game doesn't convey all that well how to go about playing classic Fire Emblem. Blazing Sword, for better or worse, is designed with the sole purpose of being easy to get into and gradually increasing in difficulty as the game goes on. This means the game is tutorial heavy early on, which can admittedly be annoying for longtime series fans, unless you happen to have been in the game before, in which case Lynn hard mode removes the tutorials. But for people that are new to the game, it's a great way for them to learn all of the mechanics in a nice steady pace while also getting some good story in the middle. At its core, the gameplay of Fire Emblem Blazing Sword can be best described as Fire Emblem in its raw form. There are no skills and no weird gimmicks. While some might view this as potentially boring, this actually makes it very easy to pick up and understand thanks to that same simplicity. In this game, two things are most important: the weapon triangle and terrain. The weapon triangle, introduced in Fire Emblem 4, can be best described as a rock-paper-scissors system where buffs or debuffs are added depending on whether you win the triangle. In Blazing Sword, there are two triangles which goes as follows: swords over axes, axes over lances, and lances over swords, as well as light spells over dark spells over element spells, and element spells over light spells. It's a pretty cool system that has stuck around in virtually every Fire Emblem game since, though it is noticeably integral to the GBA Fire Emblem games, though you'll need to be wary of Reaver weapons that reverse the triangle. The second most important thing is the terrain. Scattered around the maps will be forests, forts, villages, and several other locations, each with their own perks when a unit stands on them. Units in forests get a small boost to evade, making them harder to hit as an example. This system can be very helpful when predicting and baiting enemy units. You could stand next to a forest and provoke them into attacking from it, or you could choose to stand in it and reduce their chances of hitting you. Now, a huge part of this game is the permadeath mechanic, where once a character dies, they are gone forever, either forcing you to move on or restart the chapter. However, unlike many Fire Emblem games, this is actually forgiving in this aspect, as any units that die in Lynn's campaign will come back in Hector and Ellywoods, allowing the player to continue playing without resetting. It does a good job of easing you into it. Though from there, permadeath is in full effect, so be careful. For me personally, this mechanic does force me to play carefully because I'm either losing out on time, or a unit that could be helpful in the late game, and I can't really bring myself to play a Fire Emblem game without it. Though I do realize some might miss having casual mode as an option, this might make it easier to give the other games a try once you've beaten this, as this was the norm until around Awakening. Anyway, let's talk about Ellwood and Hector's campaigns for a bit. So both of their campaigns are roughly the same, although you unlock Hector's once you beat in Ellwood's. Hector's campaign features many exclusive chapters, and is a bit harder than Ellwood's story. After completing each campaign, a hard mode variant is unlocked. Now, I have not done Hector hard mode, but I have heard some horror stories, so if you plan to play it, just know going in, it is one of the hardest modes in any Fire Emblem game. I think one of my favorite aspects of this game is the great map design. There's quite a variety of objectives across the game, and while it is primarily Siege chapters, there's a handful of Fog of War, Defense chapters, Defeat the Boss chapters, and so on. If there's any pair of chapters I did not like, it would be Battle Before Dawn and Night of Farewells. Battle Before Dawn is an intense chapter. There are two recruitable green units far into enemy territory. In order to save them, you need to rush over and talk to them. However, this is made a problem by a massive amount of enemies, as well as the chapter being a Fog of War chapter. Another thing is that one of the green units is only recruited upon completing the chapter, so you are forced to try and keep him out of attack range. Still, while I remember the chapter giving me a lot of pain as a child, it wasn't all that bad to do now, even managed to beat the boss. My reward for that, though, was Night of Farewells. And guys, this chapter kinda sucks. You have to move across these platforms that appear and disappear as the game dictates, and if you get left behind, you have to wait until the chapter is basically done for them to catch back up. And it wasn't all that hard, just annoying. If you want an example of a chapter I like, though, False Friends is a pretty great one, albeit reused from Binding Blade, which, without spoiling how it goes, is probably one of the best examples of a Fire Emblem chapter. A big thing with this game are side quest chapters. When certain criteria are met at different parts of the game, optional chapters are unlocked. There are 9 of them in total. This is a pretty cool system, though might be jumping the gun a bit, but it's a system that was much more in-depth in Binding Blade, though it could be in the name of maintaining the game's simplicity. Now, one of the most memorable aspects of this game is the presentation. While at first glance is nothing special, the battle animations are over the top and make every fight satisfying. The music is also pretty good, but it's not my favorite soundtrack in this series, which is sad because there's quite a lot to appreciate here, some favorites of mine being the battle theme and boss themes. This game also pulls a lot of visual and audio assets from its predecessor Binding Blade, which makes sense as both a Game Boy Advance sequel and being a prequel to Binding Blade as a whole. However, I do find the overall quality a lot better, but having come out afterwards, I suppose this is to be expected. Still, I think it holds up on its own, and I like it a lot. In conclusion, Fire Emblem Blazing Sword was a treat to revisit. The game perfectly encaptures what Fire Emblem is at its base form, while also delivering a fairly engaging story. The gameplay is also identical to the other Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem games, making it a very good entry point should you wish to experience any of these games. And that was the idea. I absolutely suggest playing it before you play Binding Blade, as that game is so much harder, but that just might be me. Anyways guys, that's basically the review. I'm really glad this game still holds up. I love it so much. If this interested you at all, hearing me talk about the game, I suggest you guys go and play it. Seriously, this is one of the best Fire Emblem games. Definitely one of my favorites. My actual favorite is Path of Radiance, but I'm not reviewing that today. And also, it costs like an arm and a leg to get. Do not buy it. You see that? Do not buy it. Alright? Wait for a GameCube Virtual Console, or you know the other option. Do not buy it. You see? Do not. Okay. Alright, now that we're clear on that, I also have streams that I did of this game. If you guys are curious and want to see more of it, go and check that out. That's where I took basically most of this footage is from my streams. If you guys enjoyed that, seriously, go check that out, and you'll get to see the game in more detail, hear me goof around, and all of the insane memes that came out of it. Either way, thank you guys for tuning into this review, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye! Side note, I realize, technically, the translation that Fire Emblem Heroes refers to this game as Blazing Blade. To me that sounds stupid as like a title. And two, it also calls Fire Emblem 6 Binding Blade, so they're both BB. So I'm trying to mitigate confusion and just have it be BS. Alright.